be screwed, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the third part of, What If Issei, Rias enter Beelzebub. Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of WD0345 on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Lamia puffed out her cheeks as she was left to dangle on a piece of chain above Kuo Academy. When she had agreed to follow Fiorucci towards this area of Japan to ensure he wouldn't get hurt, she had expected herself to mainly stay around his house and fix his bones when he needed help. But why was she being used as a damsel in distress? What a cheap and overused plot point. She grumbled quietly to herself as she stared at the battle going on between Gremory-sama and Citri-sama, and while she was rooting for them to save her, she was a little bit disappointed to see that Fiorucci wasn't there. Not that she wanted him to be there for her. No. She was just mad that idiot wasn't there when she was there because of him in the first place. Had he just been a little bit more responsible, or normal, then the requirements of her help would have been much less and she could have just popped in and out randomly throughout the day, as a side character should. Not be a damsel. I can hear you grumbling, the fallen angel, Kokabeel, muttered in annoyance as he stared at her. In response Lamia narrowed her eyes to slits, not backing down against the man as she showed the ferocity of a young growing woman who was peeved. Kokabeel hesitated, having experienced her rants and tantrum throughout the 3 days he had her captured, and returned back to the entertainment before him with only mild discomfort written on his face. Lamia huffed, knowing better than to feel satisfied at scaring the fallen angel to shut his trap. Her mother could do better, and that was with Jabberwock if she so chose to. She watched, mildly impressed at seeing the Gremory heir and her peerage deal with the trio of Cerberus dogs. But at the same time greatly annoyed that she was still chained to the bottom of this fallen angel's chair. When she got out she would give Fiorucci the beating of a lifetime. No, wait, she already had. Then a beating of 2 lifetimes. Sadly, it seemed as though Kokabeel had accidentally destroyed the rational part of her head, or the current scene didn't really require a straight man at all, so Lamia had been reduced to this common stereotype of comic relief. She watched briefly as that handsome knight appeared again and stopped the Cerberus from escaping just as the lightning mage destroyed it with her magic. Lamia bit her lip, eyeing the destructive power with a contemplative look. Oga is better, Lamia thought, but a sweat drop formed on the back of her head. That's not a good thing. Just as the thought hit her, another Cerberus, which had been guarding her from below, was struck with a massive blow to its side. It roared as its 3 heads flailed in the air, drowned out only by the loud boom from where the hit had impacted with its body. The Cerberus slid across the ground, and Lamia was happy, and slightly annoyed, to find Fiorucci standing there. The young man, still dressed in the Pillar Squad's uniform, was staring impassively at the fallen-over dog. Her eyes were blank when she realized that Kirin was inside him. This guy is so broken, she thought. A pair of tunfas twirled in Fiorucci's hands, and the young man grinned at the Cerberus. Lamia was slightly disconcerted to see that, as while Fiorucci's body was influenced by the demon inhabiting his body, the influence only affected personality and bodily functions, even then Fiorucci can reject the intrusion. That means while Kirin was affecting Fiorucci's expressions and body movements, Fiorucci ultimately contained a small snippet of such emotions inside him that made him not subconsciously reject such blatant out-of-character actions. Lamia, Fiorucci said, his voice confused as he stared at her hanging under Kokabeel's chair. This wasn't what I expected when I came to save my damsel. The pinkette puffed out her cheeks and stared at Fiorucci balefully. It's not like I want to be a damsel. In fact, I'm more happy that I broke your sick damsel fantasy. Fiorucci raised an eyebrow, then, to her horror, waggled his eyebrows. Well, you sound almost disappointed, Fiorucci laughed quietly. Lamia blanched, but her rebuttal was interrupted with the Cerberus dog bounding up to its feet and rushing to attack Fiorucci. Hold that thought, he said as he twirled his tonfas and slapped the dog back. Lamia sighed and resigned herself to wait. You know you're not that much of an enthusiastic damsel, Kokabeel commented. And you look like a fish when you're supposed to be a crow, guess we're both disappointments, Lamia shot back. XXXXXXX. Fiorucci twirled his tonfas in his hands and struck down on the three-headed dog Cerberus. Kirin, who was inside him, felt nothing more than amused annoyance at having to fight the beast-like creature. Not quite a Fenrir, he commented, then again I hated that dog. The Cerberus reared its ugly head back up, and tried to charge Fiorucci. In response, the young boy felt his muscles coil together and a surge of demonic energy filling his body up with power that, truthfully, he should not have. With a demonic energy-enhanced jump, Fiorucci drop-kicked the Cerberus dog on its middle head, and flung his tonfas in opposite directions to strike at the two heads on its sides. The spike's tonfas were more than easily able to cleave the two heads apart with the extreme brute force that Fiorucci was able to throw into the punch. The young pillar lieutenant twisted around in the air and landed back on his feet, crouched with his ankles together and hands spread out behind him like wings. The tonfas spun back towards his hands like boomerangs, and the resident Makai within Fiorucci snapped to a ready position. Amazing, Kirin doesn't seem to be inhibited at all inside his body, Tyrael muttered as she stared at the boy's movements. Hecadoth grunted, even as he helped to kill the remaining Cerberus with Agiel. He is a different type of human, Tyrael, Hecadoth said as he landed next to her, allowing Agiel to have her fun. Dr. Furcass and I believe that the lieutenant is a human vessel. A vessel? Tyrael said, her voice layered in skepticism, maybe, but that just makes everything all the more harder for us. Fiorucci twitched, having caught their conversation. His mind briefly underwent the confusion he had felt trying to understand what the term vessel meant when Kirin, sharing his mind and knowledge with Fiorucci, supplied the meaning. Vessels were humans, who in the loosest sense in the word, were empty sacred gears. Unlike other sacred gears, these vessels were the sacred gear themselves, having been mutated into this form. They held the ability to contain the spirit of any supernatural being inside them, granted they could maintain it without imploding from the sheer volume of it. It was considered to be a subspecies of sealing sacred gears and there were only a handful of humans classified under this title. Among them, only less were truly able to withstand having supernatural energy within their body before dying out. If Fiorucci was not being influenced by Kirin, he would have freaked at suddenly discovering that he was even more of a freak than Oga now, but Kirin's highly analytical personality helped him stem those thoughts. He could use this for sympathy points, Fiorucci realized. He tightened his fist and nodded, eyes burning in determination at the thought of his future chances of landing a girlfriend. All the while he ignored the Kirin-induced sweat drop at the back of his head. This opens up so many possibilities, Fiorucci muttered, eyes glazed over. Fiorucci. Lamia's panicked voice said above. The young lieutenant snapped his head upwards in confusion, and barely managed to dodge the strike aiming for his head. The cement floor ahead of him blew up, spraying cement floor bits into his face as he stumbled backwards. His hands shielded his face, and it was through Kirin's highly sensitive battle instincts that he managed to backflip away from the light spear that tried to impale him. He landed, splayed out on the ground, and narrowed his eyes at Kokabeel smirking atop his chair. Hecadoth was by his side in an instant, glaring at the fallen angel. How underhanded. Hecadoth muttered in disdain. I don't want to hear that from an abomination like you, Kokabeel muttered as he hovered downwards. You're proving to be more troublesome than I thought. Truly, if Azazel was here he'd be screaming at me for not trying to recruit you, who are a vessel, into the Grigori. That DMN fool. With a flick of his wrist, a large light beam cut through the air and tried to hit both Hecadoth and Furuchi. Both pillar members dodged, and Furuchi was only half aware about the dialogue that had sprung up between a human male and one of Gremory-san's knight. Also, that freed guy was fighting Tyrael. We won't last long against him, Hecadoth muttered. Furuchi silently agreed, as even though Kirin was one of Jabberwock's personal guard, the demon wasn't quite an ultimate-class devil. Where is Elendilin? Furuchi asked. He's guiding the reinforcements to the academy, Hecadoth muttered, though it's a moot point soon enough if the bomb goes off soon. Furuchi looked confused. I beg your pardon. Just then crazed laughing filled the air, and Furuchi noticed that the old man had done something completely outrageous, or at least outrageous in Kirin's perspective. Did he just merge the fragments of Excalibur together? And provided the necessary holy energy to empower a detonating seal on the ground, Hecadoth added. Another explosion went off between them, and the two demons jumped away with their hands raised defensively. Kokabeel appeared again, and Furuchi was slightly surprised that he was able to follow Kokabeel's movements, especially when compared to having Naga occupy him. All at once Kirin's highly analytical mind started tearing the oddities to bits. There was no secret behind the fact that Furuchi, while capable of holding much demonic energy, wasn't able to maintain an amount larger than a low-mid-class devil. This made Furuchi a bad fit for Naga, who was a wizard type, while Behemoth had reduced himself to a technique type and power type for Furuchi's bout with Oga. The reason why Furuchi was able to be so attuned to Kirin was because, as a vessel, he was still unable to retain too much demonic energy. Whereas wizard types who called upon their vast reserves of demonic energy to cast spells, power types and technique types merely used sheer martial ability and skill. Naga was inhibited due to Furuchi's inability to contain too much demonic energy, while demons like Kirin suited Furuchi just fine since they only used some energy to augment their abilities and relied mainly on their skill. This allowed Kirin to utilize Furuchi's body to the fullest. Kokabeel swung another blow, this time the arm turned to a blur, and Furuchi bent his back to avoid it. He spun his tonfas and attacked, aiming for the fallen angel's face and legs. The fallen angel parried the first attack and blocked the second one, and unfurling his wings, he slapped Furuchi to the side. Unconsciously, the white-haired boy tightened his nose to stop his tissues from falling out. He couldn't risk any break in the fighting, and the moment he really did drop his tissues he would be done for. Furuchi managed to push himself back to his feet, and barely dodged a light spear aiming for his heart. He then drew back from a light sword slash and ducked underneath a flash of light magic. The fallen angel entered a flurry of attacks, constantly switching weapons and attacks to confuse and place Furuchi on the defensive. It was only from the grace of having Kirin inside him that Furuchi hadn't lost a limb, and even that was going to run out soon. Kokabeel tightened his face and broke off from Furuchi, much to the young man's relief. He hopped away, his uniform torn and tattered around the sleeves and stomach area, and wondered why Kokabeel had retreated. Then he felt it, the wave of holy energy that washed over him and the area, and nearly blanched. Durandal. Furuchi muttered in shock, Kirin's feelings of revulsion and fear echoing from his mouth. He twisted, mind forgotten of Kokabeel, and trained his eyes on Zenobia who had pulled Durandal from its dimensional sheath. But there was another presence, something that Furuchi overlooked in his battle with Kokabeel and was now humming to thrum of holy energy in the air. Kiba had a sword in his hands. And Kirin could feel the undeniable absurdity it held within it. That sword was a demonic sword. That sword was a holy sword. That sword was a holy demonic sword. That sword was a balance breaker. That sword was heresy. That sword was divine. It was evil and good. And Kirin seemed to shake inside Furuchi's body. Like that, the tonfa-using demon ejected himself from Furuchi's body and openly gaped at it, even as he shot mildly disgusted glances at Durandal. But this is impossible, he declared vehemently, for something like this, unimaginable. Blasphemy. Yin and yang cannot be mixed together like this, it defies everything we know. Unless. Hekadoth muttered, also in shock. But how? Kirin muttered, staring at the place where the young knight held his blade. The 4 mouths were not the only ones to perish, the old man in the schoolyard muttered in shock. For Fiorucci he felt nothing, but for the demons there, especially the pillar squad, they were in shock. And the lingering feelings that Fiorucci could feel through the contract with Kirin revealed much. While the devils and angels were always at war, that didn't mean their state of survival wasn't mutual. The devils, angels, and fallen angels all shared one thing, they came from the Christian belief, which have since dominated most other beliefs, and had held strong for a long time. This strength had been under contest for years after the 4 mouths died, and if their enemies heard that the God of the Bible, the pillar of their faith, was dead, then the chances of lesser faiths declaring war on them becomes more and more a grave possibility. The underworld was within reach of most, if not all, of the faiths whom would have reason to go to war with them, and being a place where nefarious entities exist, it was understandable that the demons, the pillar exclusively, would be the most troubled with the news. Fiorucci frowned, swaying on his feet as his body ached at the previous fight and the ends that it had forced his body to meet. Kirin, Fiorucci muttered quietly. His wounds were aggravating him, and the pillars had retreated to form a rough semicircle around Fiorucci. Tyrael had her cloak ripped at the ends, revealing that her bout with Fried was much more difficult than what he expected. Aegiel had a large grin on her face, though her eyes were bouncing between Fiorucci and Hekadoth. Kirin was silent as he contemplated the meaning of his life. Kokabeel was being the same as any villain and explaining his MSTR plan to the Gremory group. What do we do? Hekadoth muttered, we cannot defeat Kokabeel with the strength we have here. The fallen angel had safely dispatched with both Gremory's knight and the Durandal-wielding exorcist. Fiorucci would have replied to run instead, but the thought of Koho Academy, the first school he had experienced such divine beauty, being destroyed was a travesty he could not ignore. He opened his mouth to say something, then a loud bang was heard and Kokabeel floated back to his spot in the sky with a reluctant flick of his wings. Alandalan, he cried in anger. Fiorucci snapped his head towards the east and sure enough Alandalan had arrived with a fresh batch of troops, their halberds pointed at the fallen angel as seals spun at their tips. Our reinforcements? Rias Gremory said, surprise coloring her features. Even Fiorucci was surprised, for in the place of the old coot that he had grown accustomed to was instead a tall proud man wearing a full-face helmet which hid all his features, even his ridiculous mustache. He wore plate armor around his chest, forearms and shins. Underneath it all was an all-black cloth and there were 3 yellow stripes on his left shoulder pauldron, with an arrow running across them. To arms, Alandalan muttered gravely. He spun his halberd and fired off a dozen demonic bullets at Kokabeel while the remaining soldiers formed defensive positions around the Citri and Gremory heir. Kokabeel blocked the shots with renewed ferocity and sent them straight back at Alandalan but the demon merely spun his halberd and dispelled them. The old coot-turned soldier calmly joined the group of pillars. I do hope you mind my tardiness, Alandalan said in a British accent, somewhere between a posh Nottingham and Oxford one, and nodded in greeting. But bugger did those old malfaction gave us a run for our money. Impeccable timing, Hekadoth commented. You know us Axiom Rangers, we're there when it counts, Alandalan muttered. His gaze then shifted to Fiorucci, by Henry's headless wife, you look like Swiss cheese my dear boy. Fiorucci scrunched his face, did you just say Henry's headless wife? Rather than that why are you British? British? Alandalan said in confusion, why I don't quite know what to make of that. I say I sound quite the same. Oh it seems the crow is coming to play cheerio lads. Fiorucci watched as Alandalan walked away and engaged with Kokabeel, who was screaming bloody DMN murder. What was that? Fiorucci asked, sweat dropping at the sheer oddity of it all. Aegwal leaned down closer to his ear to whisper it. It said that the southern fortress saw the worst fighting out of every other stronghold in Mackay. Both during the Great War and the Rebellion. Alandalan became famous for rising through the ranks of countless dead commanders and leading the southern fortress to victory in numerous battles. However, his mind couldn't cope with the stress and had developed this personality to deal with it. In fact, when he retired, he found integrating with normal life difficult and had created another personality to be able to withstand the pressure of handling it, Agiel said. Fiorucci opened his mouth. That's really sad. So he's like this because he was emotionally traumatized by the events of the war. And being in his old armor again has resurfaced those memories and personality. Hekadov made an uneasy face. Actually he did it for shits and giggles and had at one point during battle became so engrossed with the new way he spoke and acted that he got stuck in that personality. Likewise he had taken on the odd behavior of Alandalan after retirement to amuse his daughter, then found himself stuck in that too. It's more than likely he returned to the personality for nostalgia and because it was an automatic response to an old pastime he enjoyed. Fiorucci flattened his face as he stared at Alandalan's back. Upgrade, old coot, new rank, old croon. Huzzah! Have it thee you dirty swine! Alandalan cried as he took a swipe with his halberd. Kokabeel ducked underneath and snapped a quick jab with his light sword. No, not just a stab. When the strike connected, rather than a single hole in Alandalan's armor, 4 holes appeared. Kokabeel had moved so unbelievably fast that he had blurred 4 consecutive strikes into one stab. Alandalan grunted and twirled around the next blow, parrying a sloppy swipe, and reaching forward to hit Kokabeel. The fallen angel spun and rose into the air with a flap of his wings, but Alandalan was fast and he twisted while spewing demonic bullets like a gatling at the rising enemy. Hell's fury, Tyrael muttered, staring at the halberd in Alandalan's hands. It said he had went toe-to-toe with the fallen angel Barakiel in a duel using that halberd. Fiorucci didn't really know what that meant, or if it really meant anything beyond Alandalan just fighting a dude named Barakiel. Either way it was amazing seeing Alandalan do battle with the enemy that had given them so much trouble. A high-pitched whine was heard, followed closely by a very loud roar of anger. Fiorucci looked at the battle and was astonished to see that one of Kokabeel's wings was reduced to a burned crisp. Why you dog? Kokabeel roared and swooped down with light energy gathering at his fingertips. Kirin! Fiorucci yelled in alarm. But something inside him seemed to snap, a myriad of different colorful lights flashing within his mind. Collating saved data. A voice said in his mind. Analyzing base structural stats. Stats determined. Decomposing base materials. Activating compatibility protocol. And just like that, Fiorucci felt his heart lurch and his body morphed. He could feel Kirin's moment of surprise before he was forcibly pulled into his body. The demon had nary a squeak in surprise before his body was ripped apart and stitched into Fiorucci's body. It was painful, he thought. Excruciatingly painful. Unbearably painful. There wasn't a word in any dictionary to explain how painful it was. His body was physically changed, no, spiritually, no, there existed nothing left of him. The sickly sweet feeling of Kirin's soul washed over him and his bright tasteful human soul merged together. Like an amateur cook, Fiorucci could feel haphazardly thrown in salts and spices thrown into the mix, hoping to make the already unbalanced dish serviceable. The effect was an edible piece of food, just edible. But it was enough. No longer was Kirin inhabiting his body. They were now one, a singular body that existed together. Even their souls were now joined, the demonic with the plane. Fiorucci's arm, Kirin's arm, their arm flexed. And when he opened his eyes, the world was colors. Kokabeel was a dim gray color, the demons a sickly black, and the lone surviving Huma was a twisted and mangled bright white. The ground was a lush green and the sky was a myriad of yellows, reds, and blues. All at once he realized that this was how Kirin saw the world and why he wore a cloth to block his eyes. It was near maddening to see so many colors. Balance breaker. Shattered mirror. And then the world flashed. He sped forward in speeds normal to high-class devils, and surged to a stop in front of Kokobile. His tonfas spun in his hands, experiences not his own bleeding through his mind, and with skill that defied his earlier show, he had masterfully deflected the orb of light energy with a flick of his wrist. But it still had taken too much out of him, and his left arm was singed and burned, the skin flaying away to reveal taut muscles underneath and burning flesh. The ground cracked beneath his feet, unable to withstand the pressure from both the force behind his swipe and the light energy. The top half of his uniform burned away and showed off a body far more developed than what he was used to. Warning! Warning! Time duration, 60 seconds. 35 seconds green zone, reaching 40 seconds yellow zone. Fiorucci wondered what it meant by that, but then he felt the terrible ripping apart of Hia's soul again as Kirin was removed and re-stitched together, and Fiorucci was haphazardly closed back up. The pain was just as bas the first, and his lean body gave way to his human form. He collapsed on his knees, eyes rolled back to his head, fell to the ground. His hands was unable to heal in time before Kirin had been ejected by whatever the voice was and his tissues fell off. His eyes rolled to the back of his head and he could hear the terrified screams of Hecadoth and Agiel, the shocked voices of the devils, and Kokobile's scornful sneer. Lamia sat quietly, chewing on her lip as the Mumu did its best to fix Fiorucci's near-flayed left hand. There was nothing left except the muscle of his arm, which kept twitching at some mental pain, and Lamia had been near desperate to stabilize his condition before he fell deeper into his current shock when she was released from her chained-up state. After the battle on the schoolyard, where Elendilin and the Axiom Rangers managed to destroy 2 more of the fallen angels' wings, a white-armored person descended from the sky and took over beating up Kokobile to a meaty pulp. He had left after saying some things, but Lamia had been busy trying to make sure Fiorucci lived to see another day. They had quickly whisked Fiorucci back to Pillar HQ, only delaying their return long enough to ensure the safety of the Mao's sisters and using Elendilin as a quick taxi. Her mother, Lamia, had quickly placed Fiorucci in a healing trance while Dr. Fracas commanded Lamia during the surgery. All throughout the procedure she noted that Hecadoth stayed nearby and had been glancing worriedly at the operating table. She had knew that Hecadoth and Fiorucci were close, but she was surprised to find out from Agiel that the Pillar General actually considered Fiorucci as a brother. Dr. Fracas had fixed the ruptured internal organs that had been damaged from the battle with Kokobile, but the flayed hand was beyond his ability to save. The light energy was still radiating off the arm and Dr. Fracas wasn't able to continue any further than stopping the flayed hand from causing Fiorucci to die of BLD loss. As the Mumu was neutral to both demonic and light energy, it was currently sucking up the residual power while carefully and slowly layering synthetic skin over his arm. Lamia flinched. The arm would look normal, but demonic energy wasn't potent enough to rebuild the nerves of human skin and thus Fiorucci would be unable to feel anything from that arm. Lamia was slightly in dismay but kept her emotions in check as she changed his bandages, soaked the towel on his forehead, and injected the hourly painkillers into Fiorucci's foretube. As a doctor she could not allow her attentiveness to falter in light of a patient's state. There was a sound at the door, and Lamia turned around to see that Hecadoth had entered the room. She had grown accustomed to his visits as it had been a week since the battle, and Hecadoth had always made sure he was close by. However, rather than step up next to her, he instead took a step to the left of the door and bowed his head in respectful silence. Her face of confusion at his actions changed to instantaneous shock as Lady Iris stepped into the room, looking as healthy as possible, well besides the wheelchair. "Am I lady?" Lamia said in surprise, slightly embarrassed at greeting Lady Iris in her doctor's uniform. The current Beelzebub's wife smiled kindly at Lamia and pushed herself inside, not accepting the help of Hecadoth who tried to do so instead. "Evening. You are Lamia's daughter, am I right?" "You look just like her," Lady Iris said softly as she stopped a few paces away from the young doctor. Lamia blushed at the compliment and bowed in respect. "Thank you for your kind words." Lamia stuttered. Soft laughter greeted and she was further embarrassed that her lady was laughing. You needn't go so far, Lady Iris said with a gentle smile on her face. I am not here as the Beelzebub's wife, rather I am merely here as a friend seeing another. A friend? At the question Lady Iris gestured her hand to Fiorucci and rolled up next to him with a small smile. He and Oga have returned me back here to the place I love. Even if Ajuka spends every waking hour on his formulas and creations, he at least takes moments to spend time with me, and N has just been so precious after I got back. Though I haven't seen Beels yet, I take it he's happier with Oga right now, Lady Iris explained as she wheeled up next to Fiorucci. Lamia was silent as she allowed Lady Iris thread her fingers in between Fiorucci's hair. I would like it if one of my children grew up to be like him. What? Lamia muttered in mute shock. Even Hecadoth had snapped his eyes wide open. My lady, you don't know his real personality. He's a perverted, rude, and a completely disgusting human being. He chases skirts more than anything else and he's a poser, Lamia said. The words flew out of her mouth before she could stop it and she slightly regretted the words. To her surprise, rather than be hesitant or revolted with what she heard, Lady Irish smiled heartwarmingly at Fiorucci. And he is loyal, always seeking to stand beside that man. Always, even if the world was against him, this boy would be there. Maybe not obviously, maybe sometimes and never physically there, but there is no doubting the feelings inside him, Lady Iris said. He may not be a prime example of a great human being, but he is more than enough of a noble heart. Truly, he is far more complicated than you give him credit for. Lamia silently mulled over the truth in her words and quietly agreed with her. The moo made a clicking noise, signifying he was finished, and Lamia carefully lifted the body off Fiorucci. As she did, she ignored the changes his body had underwent ever since he had achieved balance breaker. His muscles had become more defined and his muscle density had increased, making him heavier and stronger, and his skin color had gained a vibrant tan to it. There was also a burned symbol in the middle of his right bicep, a butterfly with two ovals on its wings surrounding stitching-like markings. How difficult it must be for the two of you, to be friends with such a tremendous person and be unable to help him, she said to both Lamia and Hecadoth. Lamia gritted her teeth, refusing to show her anxiety to Lady Iris, and quietly nodded in agreement. Just then a groan was heard and the room descended into silence. Ajuka listened intently as Kirin relayed the events of the battle to all four mouths. The current Beelzebub, and literal genius, was calmly and analytically viewing the point of view of the Pillar Baron. You say that you had been ripped apart and stitched onto this Fiorucci's body? Surzek said, his tone slightly colored with disbelief and confusion. Yes, sir, Kirin replied with absolute certainty. In that moment, I had truly ceased to exist. My soul had been ripped apart and used to patch the weakness in Fiorucci's soul, not his body. In that moment I became Fiorucci, and Fiorucci became me. He paused, looking troubled, before continuing. I, my family, have been born with the ability to look at the world in colors. We experience things no one else does and it makes us more attuned to the world than others. When I visited the injured lieutenant, my lords, his color was no longer the bright white of a human being. It was sickly red, like a vampire, but deep blue, like a water spirit. Yet, his white light still exists, mashed together with all the different colors, and I still see my color inside him. Ajuka frowned in contemplation, knowing Kirin wouldn't make anything up. What a strange sacred gear, Seraphal commented as she touched her lips. Shattered mirror, the balance breaker, and fractured image, its ability. It should be noted, as Modia said, that given the general theme of both names, it is safe to say that the lieutenant doesn't completely become the demon in question. It is fractured, incomplete and missing vital components. It's a sacred gear used to add traits to himself, not quite like a mirror, it's just reflecting what he wants to see, Ajuka murmured. What a vain ability, but at the same time, from what I know of the lieutenant, I cannot believe he would be willing to indulge in such behavior. Or it could be the feelings of inferiority, Surzex cut in, the need and want to be stronger than what he is now, becoming those that he admires and look up to, yet remaining himself. Ajuka nodded his head, conceding to his point. There were still too many unknowns to the situation to properly deduce the root cause. What do you have to say, Dr. Fricasse? The good doctor was quiet as he silently contemplated everything that happened, and only when he was directly addressed did he snap out of his reverie. Some of what I wanted to say has already been spoken by Kirin, Dr. Fricasse said imperiously. Furuichi's sacred gear seem me to have done just that, however his human soul is incompatible with a demon's soul. How? Humans can be turned into devils easily with the evil peace system, Serafal asked, looking confused. Ajuka stepped in to explain as it was his system. The evil peace system is different. It is only capable to revive those who have already died. When that happens, the world has already processed and, scientifically speaking, neutralized the soul. Then the evil pieces counteracts the system, re-establishes the connection the soul has to this world, and then reincarnating the soul as a devil, Ajuka stated. The lieutenant's situation is different. It's a human soul being forcibly turned into a demon soul. Demon and not devil, as Makai residents are affected by different cause and effect clauses than us. The result has led to the lieutenant experiencing compatibility issues, in layman terms that is. Dr. Fricasse nodded as he crossed his arms. It is in my belief that as the sacred gear tried to circumvent the system to make Furuichi's soul compatible with that of Kirin, it began mixing and matching different characteristics within its range to morph Furuichi into something that is capable of accepting and not rejecting Kirin. He paused, allowing it all to sink in with the mouse before continuing. It is worth of note that human souls were not designed for this, and this has in fact drastically reduced his lifespan by 60 years. He should be dead already then, Sirzex refuted calmly. Dr. Focus nodded, but he already had a counter for that. You would be right, but either by luck or the sacred gear being semi-sentient, Furuichi managed to stave off this conclusion by essentially becoming part spirit and vampire, Dr. Fricasse said. It's not to the point that Furuichi would start drinking BLD or be able to call the elements to his use, but a small sliver of his soul has essentially become part vampire and water spirit. My guess is the sacred gear tried to make Furuichi capable of withstanding the drastic increase in demonic power by adding vampire characteristics into his body, which had the added effect of adding a few years into his life. The water spirit must be to repair the damaged tissue and cells caused by the massive increase of growth within a few seconds, which saved Furuichi from dying after returning to human form. It could have also been added to make Furuichi's soul more malleable for the transformation to occur. There are also other parts stitched into his soul, and I really do mean stitched. His soul has been ravaged, completely turned into something it isn't, and became an eldritch monstrosity. The fact that a part of Kirin's soul is still connected to Furuichi, however, may simply be a countermeasure to make sure that Kirin will not find any opposition entering Furuichi's body as a vessel by the new parts of his soul. This has never happened before with any sacred gears, Ajuka muttered. It can't even be called a subspecies, more like a mutation. A broken sacred gear. It doesn't matter as of now. Furuichi's mental state is so far still sane, and he can be dealt with accordingly. However, the boy is a lieutenant of the Pillar Division, and as such I leave it to Asmodeus to decide his fate, Sirzex stated. Asmodeus woke up from his sleep and blinked warily at the assembled council. As acting commander of all military forces, I will pass the decision to the current general in charge of the pillars. Asmodeus turned to Jabberwock, who was sweating bullets. Usually the pillar commander would be strong-pressed to even feel nervous about any situation, but considering he was talking to Asmodeus, who had single-handedly wrecked him when he had woken him from his morning nap and expelled him as a commander in the first place, the demon was very wary. As a lieutenant in the pillars, Behemoth, who had noticed Jabberwock's distress, had spoken up instead of his son. Furuichi is under good confidence to pull out from this incident unharmed, and I am willing to risk that he is still trustworthy to remain as a member of the pillars. I second that, Alandalan said as he twirled his mustache, his British accent still in place. Why, I am willing to say that Furuichi is too loyal for his own good. He'll whine, I can bet the Queen's throne he would, but we needn't worry about him. Good, then this issue has been resolved until further notice, Surzek said. Both Lamia and Hekadoth sweat dropped as Furuchi devoured 5 whole steaks in quick succession, Lady Iris quietly cheering him on next to him. Man, I feel half empty, Furuchi said as he downed the last steak, sorry about the bad table manners though. No, it's quite alright, Lady Iris said gently, consider it reparations for the trouble I have caused you and Oga during my runaway. Lady Iris placed a comforting hand on Furuchi's shoulder and Leia marveled at how easily Furuchi fell to her trance, he wasn't even ogling her. This was an awesome feat. He, it was no trouble at all, Furuchi grinned. Say if you're here. He trailed off. Understanding lit up in Lady Iris' eyes and she shook her head. No, Oga and Hilda are not with me. In fact, I do believe that they are currently still in Ishiyama, she said. Furuchi nodded his head and finished what was left of his steak. Lamia made sure to keep an eye out for any irregularities in his movements, even when the vast amounts of food he was consuming already was irregular behavior for him. Furuchi nodded his head, looking a bit relieved, and looked pointedly at Lamia. I think I may need more healing magic for my left hand. I can't feel anything from it. She frowned. First off, it's not healing magic and secondly, she hesitated, I can't fix it, your left hand is ruined no matter how strong you try. It looks normal, and in fact the muscle tissue and tendons have been repaired, but the skin is fake. The holy energy and the demonic energy had destroyed your nerves irreparably from the attack, never mind having it burnt and flayed off your arm. I can't fix it, maybe I could but you aren't a devil, and the holy energy is making it difficult. Furuchi looked crestfallen, no way. That means I can't hold a girl with both my arms. Hekadoth spluttered back a laugh at that while Lamia scrunched her face up. Why is that the first thing that enters your head? She yelled out in frustration. Bakaichi. Don't change my name like that. You're becoming a tsundere stereotype, Lamia. Then it's your fault. Both for being a bakaichi and a creepichi that turned me like this. She rebuked. Furuchi grabbed his chest, having heard 2 terrible nicknames tossed at him. He felt like letting loose a manly tear at his heart, shattering with the painful reminders. In any case, Hekadoth interjected, how are you feeling? Furuchi made a face as he pressed his right arm against his chest searchingly. Don't know, he answered honestly, I feel alright, but I also don't. There's an intense burning sensation all over, and I think I feel a lot more, I don't know, longevity. Probably because you now have a vampire's soul stitched into you, Dr. Fracas said as he entered the room. The white-haired teen raised a confused eyebrow. Vampire's soul? He asked. Dr. Fracas then relayed everything he had said with the mouse to Furuchi, keeping an eye on the boy's mental health as well. He reacted with a pained and terrified expression, common to anyone in this situation. But then a look of dismay passed through his face. I'm weirder than Oga now. DMN it, he slammed his fist down, how am I supposed to get girls like this? Both Lamia and Hekadoth sweat dropped. To everyone's surprise, Lady Iris clapped her hands and smiled at Furuchi happily. Doesn't Oga have 2 girls competing for his love and attention? She said, since Oga's only redeeming quality is his weirdness, wouldn't that mean you would be able to, get girls better like this? Furuchi looked shell-shocked at Lady Iris' words and his mouth was dropped open. Is that how it is? He said in shock. He cupped his chin in wonder, man, women's hearts are fickle things. That comment earned him a punch to the face courtesy of their resident Pinkette. Dr. Fracas smiled tiredly at the scene and frowned at what he still saw. While not the greatest censor, Dr. Fracas could still be able to discern the identity of whoever was in his room, whether beast or other entity. Furuchi's signature was sickly and black, rubbing off him like a rotting corpse. He could feel the coldness of a vampire, the soft sting of saltwater from a water spirit and the myriad of other components now literally sewn onto Furuchi's human body. Regretfully, that would also mean that anybody else could, and that could mean absolutely anything. Lieutenant, another voice said, stepping into the room. Behemoth strode into the room, a wondering look on his face. It is good to see you well. Behemoth-san, Furuichi greeted, looking slightly uncomfortable. Behemoth chuckled and stepped aside to let Jabberwock and Kirin in. Both Kirin and Furuichi glanced at each other, and a cold shiver ran down both their spines. Sorry, Furuichi said, what he was apologizing for did not need to be said. By all means, apologize more, Kirin replied. Just take the DMN apology. Or the next time I summon you, I'll use you to peek on the women's bath. Furuichi said. Kirin faltered, and glanced at Hecadoth, who gave him a grim nod to accept. Realizing that the lieutenant was serious in the matter, he immediately sweat-dropped. I humbly accept your apology, he said instantly, glancing at the Pinkette, who was glaring at the lieutenant with a fire in her eyes. A fire that Kirin was afraid he might have to warn Lamia about. Furuichi on the other hand was sweating as he tried to maintain his poker face, wondering if Lamia had upped the ante on her glares recently. All right then, Furuichi said, why are you guys here? Behemoth smiled, but it was mirthless and it honestly scared the living daylight out of Furuichi. I had sent you to Kuo Academy as you were thinking you were sufficient enough to handle it. Yet, it was an error on my part. There was genuine regret on Behemoth's face as he said this. As such, you have underwent an irreversible change. Furthermore, Sirzex Lucifer informs me that he will be having a summit with the Fallen Angels Governor, Azazel, and the Angels Leader, Michael, soon in Kuo Academy proper. Unfortunately, the only assets I can afford to lend in the defense of Mao-sama in the pillars would be you, Furuichi. The other pillars would be assigned with Border Patrol, due to Kokobile mentioning sensitive information in broad daylight, and would be hunting down the old Mao faction in Makai territory. So, I'll be alone. Furuichi sounded nervous at that. He had been alone when he went up against Kokobile both times, well slightly, but there was no mistaking he had been outmatched greatly. He didn't want a repeat of that. Behemoth, however, shook his head in the negative. Though it would be incredibly taxing to our already hectic reserves, I am assigning Kirin and Elim to you, Behemoth said, looking intently at Furuichi. For the most part, Furuichi was slightly confused, and put off with the two people he was assigned with. While he had summoned both ample amount of times throughout his days in Ishiyama, it was another thing to say he was friendly with them. Not to say he wasn't friendly with them, still he would still rather work with people he was more familiar with. Why not Agiol and Hecadoth? I know them best, Furuichi asked. Behemoth grunted, and to the white-haired lieutenant's surprise, he threw a tonfa at him. It wasn't one of Kirin's tonfas, it was just a regular metal one that wouldn't be out of place with a police officer. When Furuichi caught it, he found his eyes dilate, his fingers coil around the hilt like he had known it forever, and blocked the strike aimed for his head in the blink of an eye. He pulled himself up to his feet, legs spreading wide open and hunching his shoulders forward. Kirin disengaged, sliding backwards from his attack, and grunting as he stared at Furuichi behind his cloth-covered eyes. Indeed, your theory seems to be correct, Dr. Fracas. The room was silent, both Lamia and Hecadoth staring wide-eyed at the sudden violence that erupted between a pillar baron and Furuichi, even more so at how effective and fast Furuichi had been in blocking the blow. Meanwhile, Lady Iris calmly watched the entire thing with a small serene smile on her face, like she had expected this. What? Furuichi asked warily, suddenly suspicious of everyone around him. Has Dr. Fracas informed you of your new predicament? Behemoth asked. Furuichi glanced at the good doctor, and slowly but surely nodded his head at the ultimate class devil. Behemoth smiled and then stuffed his hands into his pockets. Then I'll let him explain this. Dr. Fracas nodded and began to speak. As I've already said, you currently have several different characteristics of different beasts and supernatural entities within you. One of which is Kirin himself, as he had occupied your body. I had originally thought that it was to allow Kirin to better use your body in future occurrences, however, now believe it serves a dual purpose, or perhaps this was its purpose all along. Furuichi frowned, not quite getting it. Noticing it, Dr. Fracas tried his best to explain it in a way that Furuichi could understand. You see, Furuichi, souls are like memory banks. Like a brain, only more complex, and is tied to your very essence as a living being. As you grow, so does your soul, and everything you experience, so does it. A person who is torture, will have that torture reflected onto his soul, only it would follow with his psychological and not physical perception of his torture. Likewise, as a person acquired new skills and grows in terms of power and ability, the soul will naturally reflect that and absorb the experiences. The reason it is like this, is so that after death, the system can properly evaluate a person's life. Alright, but what does this have to do with me? Furuichi asked, then realization hit him like a truck. You mean because I have a piece of Kirin's soul in me, I have his experiences and skill? Looking at the tonfas in his hand, he had to admit that it felt like he had held the weapon for years. Skills, experiences, and techniques flashed in his mind that he hadn't ever since or heard of before. Dr. Fracas grunted, close but not quite. Furuichi shot him a confused look. Furuichi, your sacred gear is called Shattered Mirror, and the ability is Fractured Image. Even when Kirin was fully absorbed into your body, you were still lacking in the fundamental ability to hold all of his demonic energy, and your body, while buffed by the hybrid soul, was still human in a sense. It should go without saying that, while you hold some of Kirin's abilities, they are either inhibited due to your body, or somewhat lacking. I agree, Kirin interjected, though it isn't your physical ability that inhibits you. The stance you took when blocking my strike, it was flawed. Your legs were too wide apart, yours too close to your chest, and while your strength is lacking, had you done the stance properly, you would have been able to use the force of your opponent against him. Your stance would have been perfect, if you were merely an observer viewing from a distance. Kirin paused, as though he had caught on to something. In fact, that is exactly what it was. You looked as though you had watched someone perform the stance, and had tried to imitate him rather than being a regular practitioner. Within the parameters of what we know of his sacred gear, Dr. Fracas agreed. Now, as you can imagine, since we have found out that you now have some ability in hand-to-hand combat thanks to your violation of Kirin Dash. Don't say it like that. We will endeavor to train you further in those skills throughout the duration of Kuo Academy before the planned summit. The reason why Aleem is accompanying you is to teach you how to properly utilize your contract holder status. I beg your pardon? Furuichi asked, confused by what he meant. Hecadoth pinched his nose but replied helpfully from the side. Furuichi, while using the tissues is perfectly fine for other people, you hold a contract with every member of the pillars. And contract holder usually do not use third-party means in order to summon demons they have a contract with, Hecadoth explained. As such, you should be able to summon us without the tissues. For reals. Why didn't you tell me before? Furuichi asked hysterically. This could have seriously helped him in the past. I would like to say something cool, but it was actually because I forgot and you didn't ask, the Pillar General said with a shrug. Don't be so casual with my life on the line. Furuichi cried. Well, there you have it. Both Kirin and Aleem will teach the abilities you need and assist you with the defense of the Mao during the summit. After the summit, we plan on having more in-depth training sessions to increase your demonic energy levels and abilities, Behemoth said, cutting off any further conversation. Alright, Furuichi conceded. He glanced at his hands warily, unsure of how he was going to deal with all of this. I should be a regular high school student, he murmured, but DMN do I not want to leave the school with such appealing girls. Anoka sighed as she fixed up the bento for her older brother. He had been sick for the past few days, telling her to leave him be while he slept the days away, and had only just recently left the room to inform her he was attending school the next day. Her brother was always a weird one, and she was ashamed to admit, he was a bit perverted, and her parents, as well as herself, were worried he may be a lolicon. Anoka would like to believe her brother wasn't so, but the evidence proved the contrary. She finished packing the bento and slid them onto the smooth wooden table that connected the open kitchen with the living room. She was slightly amazed that her brother had landed such a great apartment for them, with its Western open space theme and nice smooth wooden flooring, and she wondered just how much he had to pay for them. "Good morning, Anoka." The pinkette that was almost always attached to her brother's hips walked into the room yawning. Her hair was a mess in the morning, and Anoka was slightly concerned that she had exited from her brother's room. She didn't want to think about what her brother had done to her, or forced her to do, and had taken her non-miserable or crestfallen face at face value and had rationalized it as her sleeping forever. Yeah, right, why would a girl almost younger than her be sleeping over with her brother who was older than her? "Good morning," Anoka replied evenly. She placed an extra plate of food for the pinkette, having expected her as she had been bunking over since they got here. "Where's Furuchi?" The girl blinked at her, then pointed lazily at the room. "He's sore, so he's taking a while to get up. He'll be out soon enough," she replied. Anoka tried to filter out the ideas of just why her brother was sore, and what he had done the other night to warrant him sleeping in. "I'll go wake him up then," Anoka said warily, hovering outside her brother's door. Anoka had entered Furuchi's doors once every full moon, and each them she had laid witness to her brother's phase of pervertedness, either in the form of picture books he should not have or a camera filled with pictures she did not want to know how he gotten. Taking a breath to firm herself, she quickly pushed the door open and stepped into the room. It looked normal at the first glance, well-kept floors and books all organized on the desks and bookshelves, but Anoka knew better. She glanced warily below her brother's bed and the small black box tucked underneath his study table. Shuddering, she forcefully expelled this knowledge from her head and made her way to her brother. She looked up at her, and paused. A look of shock filled her face as she realized that the sheets had been crumpled up to the foot of the bed and her brother laid shirtless. Now, Anoka wasn't like her brother, she didn't appreciate the body of the opposite gender as much as he did, but she was still a girl. Granted, she had seen her brother shirtless before and felt absolutely nothing, and even now she felt nothing. But what had made her so shocked was the fact her brother's body had changed so much. Her brother's lithe and practically bare-bones physique had grown rougher. It was more filled out with a muscle and a small, just barely sticking out four-pack. Her brother shifted to his left and Anoka was further stunned to realize a tattoo was now on his arm. "Anoka?" Her brother's voice asked, and Anoka took a quick step back in surprise at how tired her brother sounded. Sorry. I came to wake you up for breakfast," she replied, stuttering at the beginning as her brother pulled himself out of bed. For a moment, she could have sworn her brother's eyes reminded her of a soldier walking up in a war zone, but in the next second it was gone and replaced with her brother's usual experience. "All right, I'll be there in a second," he said as he tossed himself off the bed. Anoka nodded her head vigorously and quickly made her way out of the room, wondering all the while just what the hell happened to her brother. Furuchi blearily grabbed his uniform and slid it on. He had spent the entire day yesterday training with Kirin on his style of hand-to-hand combat, and at night he was reviewing formulas and other whatnots from Aleem. It seemed magic in the real world was less hocus-pocus and more mental math than he realized. It didn't change anything either way, Furuchi would still need to rely on the tissues for now, but so far he had managed to be able to summon a pillar using the formulas that Aleem taught him, though the effect was a random demon just like with his tissues. Aleem told him that each demon had his own signature, which could be comparable to a whole new equation, and that asking Furuchi to memorize them at this time was near overkill to their already limited time frame. So Aleem had taught him a randomized equation, that used x as a function to choose a random signature of a pillar based on Furuchi's stress levels and danger readings. Whatever that meant. Long story short, Furuchi had learned how to summon pillars without the tissues, but at the same time it took too much concentration and effort for him to be able to use it in a real battle, for now at least. This mental training, combined with Kirin beating him to the ground and calling it training, had nearly burned Furuchi out. With a tired sigh, he entered the living room and sat down next to Lamia. Fiorucci, I'll be heading back home to get some supplies, so don't do anything that'll make me mad, Lamia told him as she bit into her food. Fiorucci's sweat dropped, nodding his head absent-mindedly as his body entered automatic mode. Since the day of the incident, Lamia had gotten even more intense than usual with his health, and while Fiorucci thought it was nice, it was also very painful and terrifying for him. That's great, Fiorucci said, making sure to keep his voice neutral. When will you be back? Fiorucci made sure to ignore the frantic and slightly disgruntled face of his sister as she looked back and forth from him and Lamia. The memory of her running off to call the cops was still sour in his mind. In a couple hours or so, Dr. Fricasse wants me to help him with the increase in injured people, Lamia informed him. Fiorucci nodded and finished his food, striding up to his full height and plucking his bento off the countertop. Come on, Onoka, we have to get to school soon or we'll be late. Onoka stuttered out a reply and quickly went to follow her older brother out the door, tossing a quick glance to the Pinkette who was watching them go with a melancholic expression. Be safe, Lamia. He said as he left the door, and Onoka was sure she saw the Pinkette duck her head in embarrassment in what he said. Onoka suppressed a smile at the oddly cute scene, and was slightly disturbed how her brother had fit into it so swimmingly. The two left the apartment quietly, Fiorucci not wanting to say anything with his mind currently occupied and Onoka wanting to return to school as soon as possible. Summer had already begun and Onoka had made a few friends in the school that she would like to spend some free time with. She knew her brother wouldn't mind, he always went along with her decisions. Still, as she walked alongside her brother, she couldn't help but notice the different way her brother carried himself. She had noticed it since the day he had insisted to wear the military uniform, and for a while Onoka thought he was using it to flirt with girls, but her brother had been walking with his back straighter and his shoulders more set, like a soldier. It was barely noticeable at first but now it was even more so, with his muscles that filled out the sleeves and the way he lifted his arms with each swing of his step. It was definitely there, the aura of a soldier. Fiorucci however remained completely oblivious to the thoughts going on in his sister and merely continued to mentally review the katas and forms of Kirin's style of combat. Still, when they entered the premise of the school, he had quickly buried those thoughts and refocused his eyes on the appealing girls in their summer uniforms. So much skin being shown, but not too much, after all less didn't always mean more. Stay safe Onoka, Fiorucci said as he waved his sister away. She seemed to hesitate and the eldest Fiorucci tensed unconsciously. Ever since the incident with Kokabile, Fiorucci made sure to keep a close eye on his sister, making sure the memories never came back or traumatized her. Her moment of hesitation evaporated in an instant, however, when she tossed him a brief smile and went to greet a group of first years now entering the school. Fiorucci watched her go, and sighed imperceptibly. With sluggish steps, he dragged himself over to a bench nearby and crumpled onto it. His head banging uselessly against the top of it as he tried to waste the few minutes in the morning before classes start. A plus of coming from a delinquent school, he was pretty well versed in the art of bunking classes. He took the moment to review his knowledge of the school premises, rifling through the important information other menial ones for the benefit of the Mao. He had been informed that the current Lucifer would be visiting early for some type of festival, and while that happened, Fiorucci would be tailing the Gremory's peerage while the more experienced Kirin would shadow the Mao's side. He blinked and stretched, eyeing the clouds that danced lazily in the air before finally breathing a sigh. He felt somebody sit on the empty spot next to him, and he eyed a mesh of black and green hair by his side. Ah, it's you Zenobia-san. I heard you joined Gremory's peerage, good for you, Fiorucci said. He quietly ogled her in the Kuo Academy uniform, but tried to quell his emotions a little bit as the girl seemed a bit troubled. Yes, though you were the first one to congratulate me for it, Zenobia replied with an easy smile. Fiorucci chuckled and thought that, indeed, it was strange to congratulate someone essentially selling your soul to a devil and becoming one yourself. What are you doing here? Fiorucci asked, looking at her intently. She still had the smell of scented candles around her, but it was backed up by more now, lavender maybe? Either way, he was slightly befuddled to see Zenovia so troubled in the morning. The strong exorcist that he had seen do battle against the fallen angels and freed seemed more distant in comparison. I can tell you have something to say. She glanced at him in the corner of her eye before her shoulders gave way, relaxing in his presence for whatever reason. In my time as a swordsman, I had learned that being a woman was not what was expected of me, Zenovia stated, and even then the luxuries my cohorts had wished for, like cute clothes and a chance at romance, were distant for them. Fiorucci listened quietly. It was slightly awkward, being the witness to a girl's confession of her past when you only knew her for all a few scant sentences. But Zenovia seemed relaxed around him, perhaps because they were both now essentially employed by devils and demons, but there was also something else there. The trust and faith one soldier had to another. Of course Zenovia would feel somewhat out of place with those in Grimoire's group, because not all of them had lived her lifestyle. A soldier's lifestyle. The night was close, but even then he could only reach so far into her world. How strange everything must be for her, a person who was sheltered in the institution of the church, and at the same time, trained as a warrior of faith and loyalty. Even though they were troubled, Zenovia began again after a pause, these things had never affected me. Perhaps it was best to say, I was a born warrior, but now that I'm no longer an exorcist, I've realized there are more colors in the world than before. Back then, all I had seen was gray, and I think the training stopped me from seeing anything more than just gray. But now, I realize there is so many things out there that I can't find simply by wielding a sword. She shifted, I want to experience the things I would have experienced as a woman, not as a soldier. I want to make a child, she stated seriously. That caught Fiorucci for a loop. Whoa! Wait, don't you think you're going too far there? Fiorucci cried in shock. Zenovia blinked and stared at the white-haired boy in confusion. Why? Is it not every girl's dream to have a child? To raise a family of one's own? Zenovia asked curiously. Fiorucci's sweat dropped, this girl was way too out of place in the modern era. Well, yeah, I guess, but there's more to it than that. You can't just plan to make a child like that. More importantly, who are you going to make child with? Fiorucci exclaimed, already exasperated at what he was explaining. She reminded him of Oga, except less uncaring and dense, but at the same time that wasn't saying much. He sighed, thinking back on his own dreams of finding a girl to love. Zenovia really knew how to build a melancholic atmosphere. Making a child is all great and good, but you're forgetting the journey that comes with it. The search to find someone for yourself, the days and months that come with falling in love. A baby is a lovely thing, but the journey there, the travel into that world at the end of the tunnel, can only be achieved by walking down that tunnel. Fiorucci had always had that longing, to get a girlfriend and wash her with as much of his love as possible. While he was perverted, Fiorucci had his own ideas and dreams of what a romance would have been like. And while sec and appreciation of the female body came to the forefront, there was a rather real undertone of something more. I see, Zenovia muttered, then I might have to rethink my options. I had originally chosen Issei as the father to my child, as the genes of the Red Dragon Emperor would be necessary for my child's growth, but indeed the ideas you have shown me may reveal Issei to not be the best choice. As I doubt I'd receive as much attention as I would with competing against Bucho and Fukubucho for his love, she admitted freely. Fiorucci's face soured, not liking the idea of the brown-haired kid receiving an increase to his HRM. Yes, with your description, love would be a long and arduous journey, but I don't think Issei can give me that, the light at the end of the tunnel, with Bucho being the one he is chasing for. She looked curiously at Fiorucci, a silent mask of admiration under her face. You are just like me, but at the same time you're not. I saw it as you walked into school, the feeling of looking at a soldier radiated off you, but you still have thoughts like these. You still understand these concepts. I think, yes, I think that even if it's you, even if other girls end up competing for your attention, I think you can give them that journey that they want. Fiorucci was surprised at what she was saying, trying to understand what she was implying, before he felt her hug his arm. His arm was squished between two fleshy mounds, and Fiorucci felt the sweat form at the back of his neck. It felt amazing. The soft feel of a girl pressing herself to his side and the smell of lavender and scented candles only seemed to add to the sensation. To his further surprise, Zenobia looked up at him in a small smile. I hope you don't mind, Lieutenant, but I'll be using you to discover this sensation of being a woman. Maybe at the end of it, I will have my child too. With those parting words, Zenobia stood up and disappeared into the crowd of students. Fiorucci was left on the bench, feeling completely confused at what had just happened. Then Zenobia's words sprang up in his head and tears pricked Fiorucci's eyes. Oh God! Sweet and King God above! Even if you have died, he would pray to you forever for bequitting him with such blessings. A Bishujo. More than that. A female knight has just sworn her word to fall in love with him. Fiorucci's happiness threatened to spill over and drown the school. This appealing school where romance and harems seemed rife. He could see it. At the end of this tunnel he'd bathe his own HRM. His own HRM. Students passing by were slightly amazed and befuddled at the sparkles that now drifted around the aura of a boy dressed like a soldier in the courtyard. This was only amplified by the big goofy open-mouthed smile that he made. He would have kept at it, really he would have, if not for Saji, who was stepping into view, looking puzzled at Fiorucci's current state. Fiorucci-san, are you feeling well? Never better. Fiorucci replied as he rose off the ground, a wide smile on his face as he set his clothes straight unconsciously. All the fatigue he felt was washed away as he realized that finally, a girl had an interest in him. And not the other way around. Saji seemed to hesitate for a moment before handing Fiorucci a slip of paper. The lieutenant took it with only a brief look of confusion. It's the room that the Pillar Baron, Kirin I think his name was, suggested from Kaicho. I think he said it was necessary as a base for you. Kaicho can't just hand out rooms willy-nilly, so she gave you a part of the old school building with Gremory-san and her peerage. Oh, he said warily. That meant he was going to have to be training in school too, but at least he'd be closer to the Gremory group this way. Sighing, Fiorucci waved Saji away and headed towards his new hellhole. Bunking classes was fine anyways, Alima's teaching him what he'd be skipping while she trained him in magic. While he was walking, Fiorucci more felt than he saw the eyes tracking his every movement. A piece of his soul, the demonic parts of them, reached out in search of what it was. Bursting and wanting to fight it, while other parts of his soul, the water spirit, gently swayed and abetted the rising lust for destruction. He winced, hoping that he hid enough of it that he hadn't garnered the suspicion of whoever was watching him, and continued on his way. As he passed through the doors to the old school building, the feeling of the eyes vanished, and Fiorucci's warring souls finally stilled. For all the good things happening to him lately, Fiorucci had realized that Lady Iris was right. It came with being weird. Probably God's way of compensating him. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 4. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author WD0345 on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.